Hi everyone, my name is Wasim Al-Sindi and I'm the managing editor of the new Cryptoeconomic Systems journal and conference series. And so I'm based between the MIT Digital Currency Initiative, which is a research group based at the MIT Media Lab, and the MIT Press, which is a mission-driven non-profit scholarly publisher. So I tried to make this talk quite short, so I'm going to jump straight in. So one of the places I always like to start when framing a conversation, especially about something like scholarly communication, as is the subject when we're talking about journals and conferences, is the difficulties that humans have to communicate. So, we're humans and we've been humans for millions of years, and the way that we choose to communicate is through small mouth noises, which we enunciate by pursing our lips and, tongues and all the rest of it going in there. So in order to have a conversation, between a pair of humans, there needs to be basically two translations need to take place. In my head, there are some neural impulses. We don't know where they come from yet, but let's skip that for now. I down convert those into small mouth noises. The recipient or the person on the other end of the conversation or the YouTube video hears those small mouth noises, and they have to decode what they mean using language, semantics, context, also non-verbal cues, people moving their hands around, eye contact, and so on. So this is actually very difficult, and we're still really bad at it. So here's a meme just behind me on the screen. A balaclava wearing a balaclava while playing balalaika on black lava. So obviously those words look and sound quite similar, but they clearly mean very different things, as you can see from the picture. So sometimes we have words that are very similar, that have similar sounding, that have different meanings, and we have words that have very different meaning, different sounds that have the same meaning. And of course, I'm conducting this conversation in English, which is just one of countless languages on planet Earth. And there's always context and local customs and different variations from place to place. So we're already starting. The point I'm trying to make is we already start from this very challenging commencement point. So to help us communicate more effectively, we can use things like conceptual frameworks to try and leverage abstraction, to try and make things simpler to understand, to use differential discretization to tear apart the similarities and tease apart the similarities and differences of different things, or to use these frameworks to help us define things more precisely than without them. So what we've got on the screen here are a series of kind of stacks of layer representations. I call them metastacks. And so these aren't representing anything real in the sense that, say, an OSI networking hierarchy framework is trying to do something quite concrete. This is more of a kind of a metaphysical exercise where in the left-hand example, we're taking a blockchain network or any kind of peer-to-peer type cryptocurrency type network, and we're teasing it apart into these kind of meta layers. And this work is building on some work that was done by Vitalik Buterin in 2017 in an article called The Meaning of Decentralization. And we pushed this forwards in the token space paper a little bit further to add some extra an extra layer and then to use these layers to invoke some attempts at definitions of certain kind of sticky or semantically muddy words. So for example, one of these words is immutability, the resistance to change of something. And you might be able to define immutability as primarily a logical and protocol layer phenomena, whether we're talking about data structures or we're talking and the transaction ledger, or we're talking about the code base of a particular implementation of a network. You can talk about decentralization on a particular layer. For example, you could say that monetary decentralization maps onto Gini coefficients, token distributions. You could say that social and political decentralization maps onto governance or the lack thereof. And if you continue abstracto ad absurdum, you arrive at this kind of what I call ontological metastack. You're kind of zooming out and out and out until you're arriving at this kind of it's linear, so it's not a perfect model. I would say that something that's semi-open or semi-closed, like a spiral or a DAG, would probably be better. But it's a very helpful, simple model to understand how the evolution of complexity of fields gives rise to yet new fields and yet further ones. So back in the times of Aristotle and his compatriots and his colleagues, contemporaries, there was only natural philosophy. Things are not yet discretized into disciplines and fields with theories of knowledge and epistemic traditions. And then from there, I suppose you could say mathematics and logic and number theory grew out of that. And then from there, we start to build frameworks to understand the universe, things like physics, chemistry, biology, and then we go to social sciences, complex systems, and then who knows where we go. And each time we go, things get more complicated, and we also seem to tend towards subjectivity a bit more. Although interestingly enough, if we keep going down to the bottom, and we get to sort of subatomic particles, quantum domain, we end up in Heisenberg territory, we end up in Planck territory, and things start to look a bit subjective again. So Max Tegmark noticed this, and so I called this ontological metastack a subjectivity sandwich in reference to some of Tegmark's ideas. Moving on, let's look at the state of things today in this cryptocurrency world, and specifically with reference to scholarly publishing and academic journals. So it seems that we've ended up in this very unhealthy situation here, where we have a very small number of oligopolist multinational corporations. You may have heard names like Springer, Wiley, Nature, Taylor and Francis, Elsevier. We have this kind of Pareto power law kind of situation where we have this, half dozen gigantic monolith publishers, and they kind of act in this kind of block or pseudo cartel where they maintain very high profit margins. They maintain quite restrictive intellectual property domains over authors' work, copyright and stuff like that. You're in the kind of crazy situation, which has been going on for a while, where publicly funded research, for example, most of the research in Europe in universities is publicly funded, will get published in a privately owned journal, and the people that did that work will then have to pay to look at the paper they published, unless some other special measure is taken. So that's obviously crazy. So some of the hot topics that are going on in scholarly publishing at the moment, people talk a lot about preprints, the idea of publishing things on a staging server before they've been peer reviewed. And now this is something that's really hot. There's been a big debate over this. But what's interesting is in the months since I first gave this talk, the coronavirus or SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19, a phenomena, an epidemic, pandemic even, has swept the world. And I think people have really woken up to the use of having this rapid publication dissemination pathways, because we don't have time to wait months or years for the traditional kind of glacial peer review processes to take place, multiple rounds and all the rest of it. We actually need some information, even if it's quick and dirty, even if it may not be verified or it may not be 100% accurate. It's more useful to have that now and let that work go through the validation process in the fullness of time. We also have this kind of over-metricization problem, where universities and the kind of knowledge industries around them have built all these metrics to understand how high quality a piece of work is by using citation metrics and view numbers and all these other kinds of things. The problem is when we're using these objective frame metrics very heavily and we rely on them, we create a situation where things can be, these metrics may not be great measures of the kind of underlying attributes we wish to be accessing, and you have this big problem of what's called Goodhart's law, where once a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure because it can be optimized for, it can be gained. So you see a lot of work with a lot of related phenomena of things like self-citation, where researchers will often cite their work a lot to bump up the citation numbers. What's also interesting is a citation metric doesn't take into account context. So somebody might be citing a paper because they disagree with it, or they think it's very poor quality work, or they might be citing it because they agree with it and they think it's very high quality work. And so things like objective numbers, like citation metrics, like pure numbers like that don't give any kind of metadata or context as to the reason or the basis for the citation, are also not that helpful. So we already spoke a little bit about peer review. Some people say it's too slow, it's unnecessary, it's broken. To paraphrase whoever it was, Churchill or Gandhi, I can't even remember, maybe both. Peer review seems to be the worst system that we've got apart from all the others. And so this kind of peer-to-peer human verification that peer review is quite slow, labor intensive, and it's not particularly well rewarded. We'll get onto all those things in a minute, but it does still seem to be one of the best things that we've got right now. So open access is a very interesting one. So I have a background in open source, like software and media. And for me, the words open access should map onto open source quite closely, or at least onto kind of the most permissive Creative Commons licenses. What we've ended up in the situation now is that we have these different kind of variations of open source, for open access rather. Some of them have been pushed by some of these legacy publishers as a way to be seen to be doing open access, whereas it's not really in spirit of what open access is intended to be, in my opinion. And so we have these kind of green and gold open access systems, which are not really open. And then you have the kind of platinum diamond open access, which is a bit closer to open source Creative Commons. And that's what we'll be using for Cryptoeconomic Systems for our upcoming journal. People talk a lot about APCs, article processing charges. So this is the idea that if the reader isn't paying for the work, then somebody has to foot the bill. The journal has expenses, somebody has to foot the bill. So the idea of an APC is to charge the submitting author. It's like a lottery ticket. You buy the ticket and you might get desk rejected in 15 minutes, you might get published after peer review and publication. Now, so this seems quite unfair from an economic perspective. So some people have been campaigning for the unbundling of publication economics. So you could imagine, very coarsely put, the journal process being submission, review and publication. Those are your three phases. So you could have separate fees for each of those. As your work progresses through those, you could pay the necessary fee to progress. Now, it's probably best to have an element of flexibility in these publishing models, because different kinds of researchers have different funding sources, and those funding sources may or may not include the facility for these publication fees. So having flexibility is always good. I'll talk a bit about predatory journals towards the end. This is an interesting new phenomena based in part on the fact that open access journals are so easy to set up that anyone can set up a journal, say it's peer reviewed, get some like fudge fake, gain some citation publication metrics, make your journal look like it's a worthwhile place to publish. And because of the prevalent over-metricization, publish or perish culture that we've got in universities, at least in the developed world at the moment, people are quite desperate to publish. And so they will publish, even if the journal raises a red flag or two, they may still be feel motivated to publish there. And of course, these predatory journals are taking submission fees, submission charges, and that's their business model essentially. So it's very, not all predatory journals are the same. Some are better, some are worse, some are doing the review, some are just saying they did it and didn't do it. There's a lot of kind of made up names and funny bios and headshots of random people on these websites. So please do your due diligence if you're suspicious about a journal. I may be a predatory publishing person. Who knows? I mean, our journal doesn't take any fees for publishing, so it'd be very hard for me to predate. And the MIT Press is a mission-driven, non-profit scholarly publisher, which doesn't really have predatory tendencies, but you should make your own minds up. Please don't trust, but verify. So rights transfer. Very often authors lose their copyright. They sign that over to a journal. Now we want to be as close to open source as possible, so we've asked the MIT Press, and they've agreed that we would only take a non-exclusive license to anybody's work, so the authors retain control of their work and the rights to their work, and we would just ask for first refusal to publish that, so we'll be the first to publish it. But we are very happy to see the work either interim or final stages on preprint servers. We welcome that, and more on preprint servers a little bit later. So I very much recommend the 3 articles which you can see at the bottom of the screen here. This is by Monbiot in The Guardian, Scientific Publishing is a Rip-Off. There's this excellent long read in The Guardian from a couple of years ago called Is the Staggeringly Profitable Business of Scholarship Scientific Publishing Bad for Science? And this goes into the history of where commercial publishers came from and how they outcompeted and outgunned the scholarly publishers, where everything started, things like the Royal Society, American Medical Association, IEEE, and all these kinds of things. And there's a great article here called 10 Hot Topics Around Scholarly Publishing, from which I've picked out a few of the things at the top of the screen. And the things in blue are the things that we're looking to address. So preprints, like re-engineering peer review, using open access, and minimizing the rights overhead, the rights requests from the authors. So let's introduce Cryptoeconomic Systems a bit more now. So I'll tell you a bit about myself. I've been in post at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology for approximately 10 months now, and as soon as I started, we got to work really on making the journal a reality. So a lot of groundwork had gone in by the editors-in-chief, Neha Narula, Andrew Miller, and a group of people around the MIT Digital Currency Initiative, some advisors, which we'll get to later, and some other colleagues. really trying to understand kind of the pain points, the open questions, what's missing in terms of scholarly infrastructure, and what might we be able to do to help. So as soon as I joined, we started building a peer review committee. We started organising a curated conference. We then recently completed our first peer reviewed conference, where we did a call for papers. We got some submissions, we reviewed them, we chose a conference program, and we're about to publish a subset of those papers in our first journal issue, which is coming pretty soon. So let's get to the why. Why set up a new journal? I mean, there's plenty of conferences out there, and there's plenty of computer science journals, economics journals, law journals. But what's missing is a place, like a dedicated place for cryptocurrency, for the intersection of the principal component fields that go into cryptocurrency stuff, blockchain stuff. So we're talking about the kind of technical and engineering fields like protocol engineering, distributed systems, cryptography, mathematics. You could even say thermodynamics if you look at proof of work. And then the more epistemic, social and higher order fields, the higher layers of that metastack I showed you earlier, where we're talking primarily economics, as these things have monetary networks, you could say, where the rubber hits the road and these things meet the real world. We have regulatory, policy and legal unanswered questions and things to explore. And then you also have like a great deal of philosophical questions around the nature of these things, these tokens, these assets, these networks, and also like how we can build conceptual frameworks to characterize, to understand, to get to the bottom of what these things are, the kind of the ontologies of all these things. So we're trying to build this big tent. That's what we try to do, and MIT has a reputation of doing this, to try and be the kind of neutral place where we can bring people together that may not meet or talk so often, may not work together so often, and try to build a set of shared best practices for how we can move forwards together to synthesize the insights from these different constituent component domains, these traditional epistemes, into something new, into this new field. And so this is some interesting work done by Jason Potts and Ellie Rennie from RMIT in Melbourne, where they're trying to, this is work from a few years ago, which they presented our Cryptoeconomic Systems Summit in October 2019 at the MIT Media Lab. All those videos are on the Cryptoeconomic Systems YouTube, which you can find by Googling. And if you just Google "A Journal as a Club," Jason Potts, Ellie Rennie, you will probably find the video. So the idea being here that there's an economic theory of clubs, where we talk about whether access to the club and the goods contained within it are rivalrous or not, whether they're bounded or not. And so, you know, the membership of a journal club is voluntary. It's not anonymously crowded, so everybody kind of knows everybody. It's exclusive in a way, because you either have to be asked to participate, or you have to apply by submitting a paper, or you get a job working on the journal. I applied for a job and I got a job working on the journal. It's globally partitioned and it's rationally constructed. So this is just kind of saying that journals are a bit like a guild or a society, like a microcosm of a society. And the shared good is mutual attention to an idea. So the real point of journals is to help ideas spread. So if we can verify and validate these ideas, they may become part of best practices of the new field that we're trying to mint. And so here's a really nice PetriNet visual flow chart of how a journal might work, like an autonomous tokenized journal. This is from the Decentralized Technology upcoming journal run by Statebox people, Yella Fabrizio, also Andrew Lewis Pye in London, Jason Teutsch from Truebit is also involved in this, and we've had some conversations with them, and I really enjoy looking at the way that they're framing the problem, looking at the way they're conceiving this project. It's a little bit different to ours, as we'll get on to in a minute, but I very much encourage all these experiments, and we've got a keen eye on a lot of these. So back to Cryptoeconomic Systems. This is a little bit of the human story, the human part of the engine that is CES. So we have two editors-in-chief, Neha Narula, who's the director of the Digital Currency Initiative, where I work, and Andrew Miller, who's an assistant professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and he's an associate director of IC3, Institute for cryptocurrencies, contracts, and something else. Forgot about that, sorry. And so I'm the managing editor, and I also work with Ashley Jacobson, who does a lot of the event planning and administration work. Now, we seek a lot of counsel and advice from our advisory board, which is comprised of 12 very eminent researchers, scholars, and practitioners in the field. So, and these go from people like Dan Bonet, who's done all the crypto stuff at Stanford, Shafi Goldwasser, who has a Turing Medal for zero-knowledge proofs, Dalia Malki is the lead researcher at Calibra, and so on and so on and so on. We have people from the Ethereum Foundation, from Bitcoin Core. So we're trying to mix academia and practice, economists, regulators, lawyers, cryptographers, and engineers. And so, as I said earlier, we had a conference an invited conference with 60 curated talks and 225 attendees. We covered all the continents, so we had a very high carbon load from the conference, but it was very nice to build this big tent and bring people not only from different fields and different epistemes, but from different corners of the world together to try and help us crack the big problems, to understand what the biggest priorities should be as we look to move forward with this project. And so yes, please go check out the videos. They're all online as well, and it's a huge range of stuff, from domain-specific stuff to kind of how to do knowledge aggregation, propagation, how to run a journal, and so on. How to do cryptoeconomics in practice, how to do looking at cryptocurrencies from a policy perspective. So yeah, really interesting stuff there. And this is recent breaking news, where a few weeks ago we just finished our first peer-reviewed conference, Cryptoeconomic Systems 20, which was also held at MIT, not the lab, another part of campus. This was a 2-day peer-reviewed conference program that we co-located with the MIT Bitcoin Expo, the 7th annual running of that event. We took different places on campus so we could practice the social distancing, which is so in vogue in this part of the COVID scene that we live in. And so all the videos are online now, so please search for Cryptoeconomic Systems 20. That's also the Twitter hashtag if you want to look at the social media coverage. And there's plenty more information about the journal at cryptoeconomic.systems, which is our website. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about our call for papers, the first one that just passed, give you a little bit of a look underneath the bonnet of how a journal type organization might work. So we're obviously still setting this up, so we're still learning as we go. This is like a big experiment and we fly by the seat of our pants. So fortunately, we haven't crashed yet. We've had a few wonky turns, but we managed to keep in control and keep pushing forwards. So we had a call for papers for the conference just passed, this May 20 Cryptoeconomic Systems conference. And we opened that in early September, and we were going to close it in late October, but we pushed it the deadline further a little bit more to encourage a bit more participation and to get some more papers in. So deadlines are the most powerful motivating force in the universe, as anyone watching this video can probably attest to. And so we only really got a lot of visibility on the call for papers at the deadline, and that by that point people were rushing and scrambling to finish their papers, but they couldn't get them in time. So we allowed a little bit of a grace period, and we ended up with a huge increase in submissions. We 4x'd our submissions from around 20 to around 80. And one of the reasons for that is that one of the bigger conferences in this space that's been going for over 20 years called Financial Crypto, FC. And so unwittingly, by extending our deadline for 3 weeks, we ended up being, the revised deadline ended up being slightly after the author notifications for Financial Crypto, which meant that people got their feedback as to whether their papers were accepted or rejected before our deadline. So a lot of people turned around, presumably those that weren't accepted, and also submitted to our journal, so to our conference call for papers. So one of the concerns we had was that we would end up with a lower quality batch of papers. However, what seems to have been the case is we ended up catching a lot of quite high quality interdisciplinary papers that were maybe not the FC was maybe not the perfect venue for, or at least not yet. So then once we got all these papers in, then it came to analysing them. And so we engaged in our first peer review season. We had 42 members of our program committee who did an excellent job reviewing these papers under very difficult circumstances with a truncated peer review period over Christmas and New Year. And so from the 80 paper submissions, we ended up accepting 26 of those for the conference, and a subset of those 9 also for the journal, for the an inaugural issue which is coming soon. And so we targeted 3 reviews per paper and that would translate to 5 reviews per PC member. As 64 papers went through to review, we desk rejected 16. And one thing we learned from this experience is that matching the papers to the reviewers, that is one of the challenges that we have. Some reviewers want to see a wide and diverse range of papers outside of their expertise, and some don't. So we're still learning how to best do this. And so at the very bottom, you've got what is the review portal we use is called Hot CRP, Hot Crap. And what you see here is what you can call, to get that out of the way, what you can call, what they call the procrastination chart. So this is the amount of time until the deadline versus the fraction of reviews completed. So what you can see on the left, it's Cryptoeconomic Systems, and on the right it's financial crypto. So we can see we have this kind of like biphasic distribution. Where we had 2 kind of big pumps, where one of them around the true deadline, one of them around the optimistic deadline before Christmas. With FC, you can see that they had like one big rush around the real deadline. But what's very interesting to note in both of these cases is that the deadline is little more than the midpoint. So if you set your deadline to when you need your papers, you're going to have a bad time. And that's something I've learned the hard way. Yes, not going to do that again. Okay, so one of the other really interesting things that we started seeing in the data after we got all of the reviews back was what you might think of as disciplinary bias. So when a reviewer reviews a paper, when a program committee member reviews a paper, we ask them to give a score between 1 and 5, depending on whether this is like a reject, a weak reject, an accept, a weak accept, an accept, or a strong accept. And so you're kind of grading from 1 to 5. But what we noticed is people from different fields or from different backgrounds use that 1 to 5 score quite differently. We found that people from more technical fields were a little bit less generous with the score, shall we say. And so we ended up having to calibrate our scores a little bit more to try and adjust for these kinds of variations. And just to do a sanity check to make sure that some papers weren't getting a much harder time than others because of the nature of the reviewers and their preferences when they're scoring grading preferences, and also to make sure that we knew when certain reviewers were giving overly generous or overly stingy feedback compared to the mean and the median, the norm. So that's something also we only really realized we had to correct for the 11th hour. Now we're much more attuned to it, so this is something that will get easier with time. So I want to talk a little bit about interdisciplinarity. So this is one of the key things that we're trying to do here. We're trying to reach and connect these kind of disconnected epistemes in the research ecosystem. Like, so economists and mathematicians may not talk to each other very much. They may use different terms. They may use different phrases. They have different publication cultures. They have different incentive alignment to engage in interdisciplinary work versus work inside their episteme. So this is something that's really quite a challenge. And one thing that really stood out for us is the variation in publishing cultures between different fields. So for example, law reviews are very much almost all run by students. In economics, if you're a US academic and you want to chase tenure, you pretty much have to publish in one of the kind of half dozen monolithic journals that's existed for 60, 80 or 100 years. It may take you several years to publish in there. And in computer science and related fields, reflecting the fast-paced move of these technology-driven fields, things tend to get published and disseminated through conferences first, and then published and bundled together and published as proceedings. So it's a challenge to make these things mutually legible and to find a way that we can become credible in these different fields, so that what our researchers contribute to this interdisciplinary commons is also recognized and is incentive compatible with their kind of career trajectories and quests. So this is a really nice picture from Harvard Bioinformatics Lab, missing the credit there, MC Escherina in the bottom. And I like this picture because it sums up a lot of what interdisciplinarity really is trying to do, the logics of interdisciplinarity. So on the left we have molecules, in the middle we have cells and receptors, and on the right we have silicon. And so the idea is that we're trying to form this kind of contiguous spectrum between all these different fields, approaches, disciplines, reservoirs, and fundaments of knowledge, epistemes and ivory towers, to try and find a way that we can network and connect all of these things together so that we can learn from each other in a more rich sense. And this is one thing that I always noticed in my prior research career, when I was always in the interface of fields between physics and chemistry, between astronomy and chemistry, between biology and physics. And so this interface dwelling is a very rich place to be, and it has been for a very long time. And you can also map this to kind of the Kuhnian concept of paradigm shifts, Popper's three worlds, and all the rest of it. So more on that in my token space work, which is located elsewhere. So this is a kind of funny slide, this escaping the gravity funnel. And the reason I put this in is because we're trying to not fall into this wormhole of being perceived as a all singing, all dancing MIT project that's for MIT's benefit and glory alone. What we're trying to do here is build a piece of scholarly infrastructure for the benefit of the commons. So most of the people that review the papers are based outside MIT. Most of the advisory board are based outside MIT. I'm based several thousand miles away from MIT. And of the two editors-in-chief, only one of them is based at MIT. And so we're trying to push this thing out into the community. After we've built it, initiated it, trying to push it out to the community, kind of decentralize this thing. And that's a necessary precondition for it to survive and thrive. Because if it's perceived as coming out of one institute and being dominated by one institute, then it'll be very hard to gain credibility and make sure that everybody feels that there's a level playing field. So let's talk a little bit more about interdisciplinarity. So you might imagine a network node map where each of the dots is an episteme or a field. So interdisciplinarity is kind of the edges between the nodes. You're interpolating between these areas. You might consider multidisciplinarity as simultaneously occupying more than one of these nodes. And you might consider transdisciplinarity to be existing on a kind of a separate metaplane or a separate dimension, transcending these nodes and these edges, but somehow still drawing from them. And there's some nice papers linked or screenshotted here, which I quite like to refer to, especially the epistemic trespassing paper by Nathan Ballantyne, who's an epistemologist at Fordham University. And so he has this interesting idea, and I can just sum it up from the abstract. Epistemic trespassers judge matters outside their own field of expertise. Trespassing is ubiquitous in this age of interdisciplinarity, and recognizing this will require us to be more intellectually modest. So in my opinion, we're all trespassers now. We're all judging matters outside of our expertise and discipline. I'm more so than arguably anyone, as I'm trying to connect all of these different technical and social scientific fields within which I have absolutely no training. So maybe that's good because I'm not weighed down by this epistemic baggage of a particular ivory tower, or a relevant ivory tower in this scenario. Or maybe it's bad because I'm a ignorant fool that doesn't understand his lack of training and how that impacts ability to pass these things. You will have to be the judge of that. So again, we spoke about this career compatibility, the seeming disincentive for being an interdisciplinary actor, whereas somebody that is maximizing their actions for tenure would probably not go down these risky side avenues. They'd probably stick to more tried and tested normal science, as Kuhn might call it, or status quo research, let's say. There's also an argument that there's less tolerance in certain aspects of research, both inside academia and outside, for doing this kind of multi-transdisciplinary work. It's also arguably harder to fund, although this situation is probably getting a little bit easier with time as the value of interdisciplinary work increases, or the perception of the value increases. So let's talk a bit about peer review. So publishing cultures vary across fields, as we said. That also means that peer review practices vary across fields. And so the notion of academic service, this idea that academics should put in work for the benefit of the ecosystem of their field, is well recognized, and that's been around for a very, very long time. However, there's not the same recognition of it in outside academia in practice, with the possible exception of this rise of big tech research programs think about like Google research, Microsoft research, and so on. The researchers based there, especially senior principal researchers, seem to have more bandwidth for academic service than a lot of academics that I seem to interact with, which is quite interesting. So that's an interesting inversion which may be taking place there. So one of the things that we're trying to do, one of the contributions we're trying to make to peer review, is to open up the process a little bit, or at least the outputs of the process. So we would like to do, and this is something we've started to do with the first outputs from our peer review process for the conference, to synthesize review summaries from the comments the reviewers made and publish those alongside accepted papers to give some rationality for the decisions, the outcome of the peer review, and also to highlight and foreground some of the interesting points raised in the work, opportunities for extension, critiques, and so on. And that's so far been very well received by most authors, because it's an opportunity to help them develop their research, get some real kind of detailed expert judgment on that. And so yes, I mentioned open peer review. So the idea being that if we have an open output from the peer reviewing process, I mean, you could even open up the whole process in due course. The idea is we want to encourage conversations to carry on. We want to encourage greater transparency, wider debate, and set higher standards. So we have to remember that in the field of cryptocurrency, people are pretty much printing their own money. So if you're printing your own money, you'd expect to be held to a high standard of account, and to undergo some rigorous validation and verification. And that's what this peer review process is meant to do: to validate, verify, and also disseminate the findings and the outcomes of that. We're still finding our way around this, so we're very happy to hear any suggestions, comments, critiques you might have of the processes we're using as well. So here's an interesting concept that we're working on, which we've been calling peer-to-peer review. Also, people might call it retrospective peer review or mercenary peer review. The idea being that we can go look for papers to review in this kind of overlay journal format style. The idea being that we can go back in time, we can go to any field and pick out papers, say something from 30 years ago that was a cute piece of sci-fi then, but seems to have predated and predicted a lot of what we see in computational marketplaces, or the thermodynamics of proof of work, mining, and so on. So there's papers that were so far ahead of their time that people didn't really grok the impact and significance back then, or that so much work has been built upon them that the original underlying work has taken on a new set of meanings. So we're interested in revisiting even like papers which have been studied to arguably to death. So things like the Nakamoto paper, or Harbour and Stornetter's work on timestamping, or Lamport's work on distributed timestamping, and the Byzantine generals problem. So all of these things were of their time, but as in the fullness of the years intervening, they've taken on a new set of significance and context. There's also an opportunity to set the record straight if things were found to be incorrect, or there were subtleties or nuances which weren't considered. We can then layer upon those, and errors in proofs, models, and mathematics, and so on. So let's talk a little bit about the interaction of academia and practice. So one very interesting thing about the cryptocurrency field is, as we all know, this thing did not come out of academia. It's specifically very much the opposite. Key papers were posted to random PDF servers by either pseudonymous people or people outside universities for the most part. Now, the other interesting thing about this is when you look at Bitcoin itself. So Bitcoin is this very kludgy solution to a very serious set of problems, timestamping, double spending, and so on. But if you look at the individual components of Bitcoin, let's say, the blockchain, Merkle trees, peer-to-peer network, consensus, fork chain rule, and the economics of the subsidy, each of these seems to be suboptimal in itself. So you could imagine a great deal of easy, low-hanging fruit to improve any one of those particular elements. Now, of course, if somebody goes away and improves one of those elements and then publishes that work, then that's great, but they improved it. So that means that, if they wanted to build a cryptocurrency, they would still be building it. And then that's different to Bitcoin, which is obviously leaderless, and the progenitor or progenitors seem to have disappeared a long time ago. So the other thing that's interesting about academia and practice different in terms of differences. There's very distinct approaches and philosophies, and I would even go as far as to say is there's also like a little bit of mistrust or misunderstanding between the two. And that's something we're really trying to help bridge. So cryptocurrency developers seem to be a bit skeptical of academia. They do much of their communications in back channels like IRC, Telegram groups, and so on. And like academics don't seem to be that much involved in those types of conversations. Academics tend to be very thorough, move slowly. That's where their incentives are aligned. Practitioners tend to be a bit more moving fast and possibly breaking things. Now, I'm sure everybody watching this video is aware that there's a great deal of structural and ontological problems in universities, like what is the point of a university in the post-digital age? And that now we're here in the COVID scene in March 2020, where all the universities are moving online. So then you have to ask yourself again, like, what is the point of a university? It seems that many universities look more than credential factories now, and so even the kind of physicality of the credentialing factory seems to be crumbling or dissipating or going up in smoke, dissipating at the moment. So yes, and we'll talk about scholarly service again because I have an interesting slide to show you. So people have been complaining, academics have been complaining about doing scholarly service, things like reviewing papers and sitting on committees, since the 7th century BC. This is a group of Assyrian academics, astronomers, you could say, who were complaining that their teaching load was too high. So this is an ongoing problem. It's very much an eternal problem. So this is something that we're trying to figure out how to incentivize and encourage the hard work, the thankless task of peer review. And so beyond the kind of this nebulous notion of service. And so we're very much open to ideas. We'd like to hear from people. There's work like the Decentralized Technology Statebox journal I showed you earlier, where they're trying to use tokens to do the incentivization, constrained reputation tokens. And now there's a talk by Jason Teutsch at the Cryptoeconomic Systems Summit in 2019 called A Scalable Store of Reputation, which I recommend you check out. This is a very constrained reputation model, not like the usual kind of problematic blockchain reputation systems, which we would not look to implement for quite a lot of reasons. So we're still very interested in exploring that further. We haven't gone down that road yet. So curious to hear any thoughts that anybody might have. Open access. So I just mentioned about open access, so how it maps onto Creative Commons and open source when it's done well. But when it's not done well by, let's say, legacy publishers or predatory publishers, fake journals and so on, then this kind of pay-for-play model really sucks. Mirror journals suck. The idea that there's an open access one and a closed access one, and the payment model is what determines which one you go into or how it's accessed, the economics of access. Open access journals are perceived poorly because of these predatory journals and low quality journals, which is a bit of a headwind for us. I hope that we've managed to, now that we've managed to successfully bootstrap our venue, or at least start to bootstrap it, we'll be overcoming this particular obstacle. But I heard firsthand in person from people at conferences who told me, oh, I got the email from you about your journal. I just thought it was a scam because you used all these famous people's names and MIT's name in it, but I'd never heard of you. And so, yeah, people thought I was a scammer. People thought I was a predatory editor. So it's probably good that people are skeptical and wary, but it does make it a little bit harder to get one of these publications off the ground. And it can lead to this kind of vicious circle situation. And we spoke about subpub, this unbundling of the publishing economics earlier. And so, yes, there's also this community, Creative Commons and open source vibe with cryptocurrencies. Obviously, Bitcoin is one of the crowning achievements of open source software and engineering more generally. And so to have a kind of closed source model based on, like, from the field that was minted, based on this kind of triumph of open source software seems basically hypocritical. So don't want to be a hypocrite, thank you very much. And let's talk and finish off by talking about a few possible future horizons. So we spoke about preprint servers earlier. Preprint servers are great, but they also kind of, some of them have like a sort of shadow gatekeeping situation because not everything is allowed to go on there. There is a little bit of verification going on. And when there's humans doing verification, then you can bet your bottom dollar that there's politics and all the rest of it. So we're thinking of setting up our own preprint server. Let us know if you think we should or not. We haven't decided yet. We're leaning towards doing it, but it's not an urgent situation. We're also trying to understand how we can build concurrent submissions policies. The idea being that if a researcher submits a paper to one journal, they're not supposed to publish it to send it to another one until the outcome has come back. But these outcomes can take months or even years. So we've heard stories of researchers that have built new cryptographic constructions and they got stuck in the peer review process so long that the timeliness of the work and the impact of it had faded by the time that they were able to publish this peer-reviewed research, verified research. So we mustn't allow that to happen. The publishing process must reflect and respect the nature of the field, the pace of it, the trends of it, and the philosophy of it. So we're also thinking about conflicts of interest, trying to understand how to do those better. So in the traditional publishing and academic publishing system, you usually talk about interrelations between researchers, co-workers, students and professors, and so on. So that's not good enough here. Everyone's printing their own money. So everyone's got pockets full of tokens. And so we have to understand how to do that better without creating a chilling effect or putting targets on people's backs. So again, I'd love to hear more about that. Quinn DuPont gave a couple of great talks at our recent conferences, and the paper is going into our first issue 0 of Cryptoeconomic Systems journal on some guiding principles for and suggestions for ethical research practices, and we'd like to use or at least consider some of those in our conflicts of interest policy. So all ears on that one. We're looking for host organizations to hold future Cryptoeconomic Systems events. This is both curated smaller summits and the larger flagship peer review conference. We'd like to do the next conference in 2021 in Europe, so very much encourage any European institutions that are interested in hosting. We've already had several expressions of interest, and so we'd like to fill that out some more. Thank you very much. And we're also looking for sponsors to help us bootstrap the journal and to help us pay the bills. This is how we keep the journal to be the most open access possible. Nobody's paying to submit papers, nobody's paying to read the papers. Everything is completely as open as we can possibly make it. And so we're funding that in the same way that we fund the conferences and other work at Digital Currency Initiative, which is through a fundraising drive. So if you're interested in being accredited as a supporter of this initiative, please also get in touch. My email address is there, editor@cryptoeconomic.systems. And I just want to finish with a couple of announcements. One of them is that we're looking to bootstrap a new research prize in concert with several other leading conferences in the space. We've got Financial Crypto from the IACR, Stanford Blockchain Conference, and Advances in Financial Technology from the ACM. And we'd like to make a committee of committees to decide on a prize for the most impactful research done in any given year. And so we're looking to raise some money to seed that prize, and there's naming rights and other benefits available. So if that's interesting, please also get in touch, editor@cryptoeconomic.systems. And just want to say thank you and direct you to our journal call for papers, which is currently opened a couple of weeks ago, and it stays open for another 2 months or so. And so, yeah, this is Cryptoeconomic Systems, a new diamond open access journal published by the MIT Press, exploring impactful original research and reviews, analyses, systematizations of knowledge in the interdisciplinary domain of cryptocurrency and blockchain technology. And thanks for your time.